Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Welcome to the final day of the 33rd International Churchill Conference. We had a very special day yesterday, particularly last night. We've got a special day today as well, with the sessions that we have this morning, and then our visit to the National Churchill Library and Center this afternoon on the campus of George Washington University. A few quick housekeeping items. Our bookstore adjacent to this room and the Chinese room will be open today from 9 to 12. It will close at noon, and that will be the end of that. The Churchill display in there, if you have not yet seen it, is worth taking a look. And also the Churchill for Schools desk, manned by Kevin Jones from Bloomsbury Publishing. Remember, we need you to get the word out about that to the schools in your community. We have a special guest with us this morning who just arrived because he was finally given permission by the U.S. Navy to leave his ship for a few brief hours, and that is Commander Paul Allgaier. He is the present commanding officer of the USS Winston S. Churchill. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator for our first panel, my very good friend, Mr. Ted Brummett.
Good morning, Churchillians. I want to begin by congratulating all of you, you hardy Churchillians, for joining us at this un-Churchillian hour of 9 a.m. Churchill was, we all know, a man of tremendous energy, but I can't help but feel that if we lived in the true spirit of Churchill, we'd probably all still be in bed at this point of the day. Though, of course, we would have read all of the newspapers, and we would have worked through all of the daily correspondence by this point. Now, of course, unfortunately, I feel that many of us are probably lacking in the amount of domestic and secretarial assistance that Sir Winston had throughout much of his life, so perhaps our failure to emulate his morning routine is pardonable. I'm Dr. Ted Brummett. I'm the Senior Research Fellow in Anglo-American Relations at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, which is at the Heritage Foundation, located here in Washington, D.C. The title of our panel today, on Great Contemporaries, has a truly Churchillian ring to it, and I'm delighted to be joined on it by three distinguished Churchillians who will be speaking on men who played important roles in very different ways in Churchill's life: Sir John Anderson, Mackenzie King, and Lord Moran. Our first speaker, Dr. Kevin Ruane, he tells me that it rhymes with pain, if that's useful to you, is Professor of Modern History at Christ Church University in Canterbury in the United Kingdom. His latest book, Churchill and the Bomb in War and Cold War, charts Churchill's evolution as a nuclear statesman and has been described by Andrew Roberts as hugely impressive, gripping reading, and the best book yet written on the nuclear Churchill. So go buy your copy immediately. Today, Dr. Ruane will be looking at Churchill's relationship with a man he describes in his book as unjustly unsung, Sir John Anderson, who led the British wartime effort at Churchill's request to build an atomic bomb. Our second speaker, Mr. Terry Reardon, began his career in English banking, continued in Canada. Bridging both countries sparked his interest in the relationship between two great prime ministers, Winston Churchill in the United Kingdom and Mackenzie King of Canada. Mr. Reardon will speak on King and Churchill, the subject of his superb 2012 book, Winston Churchill and Mackenzie King, So Similar, So Different. Our third and final speaker, Dr. John Mather, is a British import, and a Scotsman no less, I should add, who served his adopted country, the United States, in the U.S. Army for 30 years. He is a distinguished physician who's been elected to the fellowship of several medical organizations, including the Royal Society of Medicine in the United Kingdom. He is a medical pathographer, a medical biographer, who studies the effects of illness on leaders and is an acknowledged expert on the medical issues that affected Winston Churchill. He will speak on a gentleman who was a diarist, perhaps, and a physician, certainly, Lord Moran, who coordinated the care for Churchill in the medical realm for the last 25 years of Churchill's life. Each of our speakers today will speak for about 25 minutes, which will leave us time at the end for about 25 minutes worth of Q&A. Let's go to our first speaker.
Good morning. It is an un-Churchillian hour. Ted's absolutely right. Thank you, Ted, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, really, for giving me this platform. It's wonderful. It's a real honor. And thank you as well for lending me your ears for the next 20 minutes. To begin at the beginning. In January 1945, as Winston Churchill prepared for the long trek to Yalta for his second wartime meeting with Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, he wrote a letter to the King, George VI, concerning the future if something went wrong, if either he or his heir presumptive, Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, should perish on the way to or the way back from the Crimea. Now, in that letter, Churchill said that if tragedy befell him, there was only one man the king should send for to replace him as Prime Minister. And here he is, Sir John Anderson. That still in the UK is met with a Sir John Who quite often. His pick was Sir John Anderson. Sir John Anderson in 1945 was an independent MP, capital I. He was a member of the War Cabinet since 1940, and he was presently Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, Churchill was fulsome in his praise for Anderson. Anderson was, he said, not only well adapted by character and outlook to shoulder the burden of the premiership in the midst of a still ongoing global conflict, but also because of the, and I quote, the general regard attaching to him from all political parties. Now, as we know, Yalta was codenamed Argonaut, and our Argonauts, Churchill and Eden, returned safely. And history, whether it's Churchill's or Britain's or the world's for that matter, was what it was. Nonetheless, I still think we ought to ask the question, what was it about this man, John Anderson, that won him such a Churchillian vote of confidence? What was the relationship between these two men, personal as well as political? Now, here's the thing. Today in the UK, never mind the United States, if John Anderson is remembered at all, it is for this kind of corrugated iron garden-based construction, the eponymous but also very effective Anderson shelter, 2.1 million of which were issued by the government in 1939 and 1940 in the hope of giving the British public some protection from German bombing. Well, I think Anderson is more than a bomb shelter, and so I'd like the Anderson rediscovery process to begin now, if you will allow me. He was born in 1882 in Scotland, in Edinburgh. He was a proud Scot. He graduated brilliantly from his hometown university in 1903. His subjects were geology, science, and mathematics. And then he spent a postgraduate year at Leipzig University, where, and the relevance of this will become apparent shortly, he did a study of the chemical properties of something called uranium. In 1905, however, he rejected a career in science, and instead he entered the civil service. A string of appointments followed. At the Colonial Office, the National Insurance Commission, the Board of Inland Revenue, to name but a few. Everywhere he went, Anderson's work ethic and his organizational prowess won him golden opinions. In 1920, he took up a new and dangerous appointment. He was about 38 at that stage. He became Joint Permanent Secretary for Ireland. Based in Dublin Castle, within a short space of time, he was on the Sinn Féin assassination hit list. 2 years later, 1922, he is back in England, and he becomes Permanent Undersecretary in the Home Office. It's the top civil servant in the Home Office. It's a plum job for a civil servant. Now, over the next decade, 1922 to 32, Anderson forged, and I'm quoting now the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, he forged a reputation as the greatest administrator of his age, perhaps of any age. His Home Office staff began to give him a nickname, Jehovah, the All-Wise. In 1932, though, in a dramatic shift of locale, Anderson heads east to become governor of Bengal. Another perilous assignment, as Churchill himself attested. Anderson, quote, risked his life continually with the utmost composure in carrying out his duties, and he twice narrowly missed assassination. 1937, Anderson is back in England, and he begins a new career in politics. He entered Parliament as an independent MP, capital I, independent MP, for the Scottish universities. You see, as an ex-civil servant, he didn't think he should nail his political colours to any mast. He shouldn't have an explicit party allegiance, but he fully supported the national government. Anderson's star soon rose. In 1938, the Home Secretary, Samuel Hoare, recognising his administrative omnicompetence, gave him the task of overseeing national evacuation policy, this being the time of the Sudeten crisis and the attendant war scare. A little later, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, appointed him Lord Privy Seal. That's a cabinet-level position where he was given in 1939 special responsibility for, wait for it, air raid precautions. Hence, you can feel the silence almost, the Anderson shelter. But he was in charge of civil defense in general. Now, our man. At the outbreak of war, Anderson became Home Secretary, and he also continued as de facto Minister for Home Security. That was a pretty daunting dual portfolio, which he initially retained in Churchill's ministry when it was formed in May 1940. Anderson wasn't a member of the small war cabinet, but he was amongst those whom Churchill ordered to be present on all occasions. In September 1940, Churchill made him Lord President of the Council, and this time that job had a seat in the war cabinet as of right. And soon Anderson was doing what Anderson did best. He was handling with great skill a wide range of unspectacular but vital domestic issues. Price controls, wages, rationing, food policy, social services, allocation of manpower. Churchill was grateful. He came to call Anderson, quote, the automatic pilot of the home front. He was grateful because what Anderson did was allow Churchill to concentrate on what Churchill wanted to concentrate on, which was basically winning the war, the military conduct of the war. Now, here's the thing. Historians have often found Churchill's regard for, quote, this dour and unattractive Victorian, and I'm quoting the late Robert Rhodes James there, something of a mystery. Now, I think it's true if you look at the slide that in dress, deportment, visage even, Anderson bore an uncanny resemblance to Mr. Sowerberry, the Undertaker, in Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist. Quote, a gaunt, large-jointed man whose solemn features were not naturally intended to wear a smiling aspect. And it was also said, to continue this, that an Anderson speech could sometimes resemble a funeral oration, which sounded as though he had not known the dear departed very well. But Churchill looked beyond the Sowerberry front. He looked beyond the pompous edifice that was John Anderson, to see a man, in Churchill's words, of far wider outlook than his civil service background might suggest. He was sagacious, he was imperturbable, he was the possessor, said Churchill, not just of great personal courage, exemplified by his time in India and in Ireland, but he was the possessor of, quote, an acute and powerful mind, a firm spirit, and long experience of widely varied responsibilities. A bit of a dull dog socially, by all accounts. You might not want to be stuck in a lift for a long time with John Anderson. He never gained admittance to Churchill's inner circle of boon companions. Indeed, one of those boon companions, Brendan Bracken, was forever sneering and sniping about John Anderson's supposedly small-minded bureaucrat's outlook. I think Bracken felt there was something wrong with the world when a servant, if not a civil servant, could somehow rise to become a master, or at least a minister of the crown. But Winston doesn't look happy, does he, really, in this picture? Maybe they've been stuck in a lift together for a while. Lord Moran, and more of him shortly, Lord Moran, Churchill's physician, admitted that Anderson's, quote, solid gifts were not those that set the PM's mind on fire. And though Winston trusted him and respected his judgment, he did not always find him, it's a slightly damning word, congenial. But at the same time, Moran was convinced that Churchill has great need of such a man. And more to the point, so did Churchill. Now, in researching my book, Churchill and the Bomb, I rediscovered Anderson. Happily so, I have to say. We didn't share a lift, but happily so. But I found something else. I found that Churchill's faith in Anderson's ability to get any job done, and done well, extended into the realm of atomic energy. You see, in addition to all Anderson's other cares and concerns, in September 1941, Churchill gave him ministerial responsibility for something called tube alloys, the top secret British effort at that point to create an atomic bomb. And in my remaining time, if I may, I'd like to dwell a little on this Churchill-Anderson atomic relationship. Now, on Churchill's orders, tube alloys, this race, this quest to harness the power of nature in a bomb before Nazi scientists gave one to Hitler, was amongst the most closely guarded secrets of the war, as you all know. In Britain, not even the chiefs of staff or the service ministers knew very much, other than in a dim way, about what was going on until pretty near the end. In fact, there were only, I'd say, 3 individuals who knew how the whole thing fitted together in its vast scientific, industrial, technical, military, diplomatic, financial complexity. One of those was Churchill, obviously. But Churchill's interest in the bomb during the war oscillated. Sometimes he was keenly and intensely interested. At other times, and I don't wish to be flippant, he had a war to run. And present danger more than futuristic possibilities preoccupied him. The second individual is here in his trademark bowler hat, Frederick Lindemann, the Prof, as he was widely known. Lord Cherwell from 1941, Churchill's very close friend and his scientific mentor. The third individual, he's not in the picture, you've already seen him, is John Anderson. He was the glue, I would suggest, that held the whole thing together, the workhorse. But Anderson, belying his stolid demeanor, also turns out to have been something of a nuclear visionary. And that, for me, was the big surprise of my research. Let me explain. As the war wore on, and as atomic weapons development gathered pace, Anderson became convinced of the need, wait for it, to inform the Soviet Union of what the British and the Americans, and indeed the Canadians, were up to. Now, his reasoning was simple. The Soviet Union, he felt, had the raw materials. The Soviet Union had the scientific brains. The Soviet Union had the industrial potential after the war to create atomic arms. It just did. It was foolish to think otherwise. So, in Anderson's mind, to avoid a future catastrophic nuclear arms race in the future, in the present, it was necessary to apprise Stalin in the most general, vague way of what the Manhattan Project was all about. To tell him that the British and Americans were working on an atomic bomb, and tell him that when one was ready, it would be used against the common enemy. No more, no less, just that. For Anderson, this was the minimum show of Anglo-American faith necessary if the Soviet Union was later to abandon any thoughts of developing its own superweapons and work with the British and the Americans and the Canadians after the war in creating what was called at the time a system of international control, a way of chaining up this calamitous power that has has been unleashed, a way of directing atomic power towards constructive rather than destructive ends. Now, as many of you may know, this man here, the revered Danish physicist Niels Bohr, is regarded as the foremost wartime advocate of post-war international control. Anderson met Bohr in September 1943 in London, and it's suggested that he fell under Bohr's spell. Not so. Anderson, to me it's clear, had worked out this thing called international control a good year before he met Niels Bohr. Instead, what you have from late 1943 is Anderson, Churchill's go-to man, and Bohr later wrote they were as close as brothers, working almost as co-conspirators within the Grand Alliance to try and move the two key figures, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, towards acceptance of the idea of international control, and beginning with a very vague casting of a fly over Joseph Stalin. With Churchill, however, John Anderson really had his work cut out. Churchill, as you probably know, was an avid atomic monopolist, determined to keep the bomb a close Anglo-American secret, Canadian secret for that matter. But Anderson chipped away. And in May 1944, thanks in no small measure to Anderson's behind-the-scenes maneuvering, Churchill agreed to give Niels Bohr half an hour of his time. Now, their meeting at number 10 Downing Street, it's a very famous moment in atomic history, was a total disaster for Niels Bohr. Churchill was under great strain as D-Day loomed. He was also in a foul temper from the beginning of the meeting, and he brusquely dismissed the Dane and all his ideas. Now, John Anderson was as dejected by Niels Bohr at failing to get a Churchillian hearing. But thanks to the intervention of another Bohr admirer, this time US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, Franklin Roosevelt agreed to see Niels Bohr a few months later, gave him half an hour of his time at the White House. And this time, Bohr seemed to make an impact. FDR was impressed. Yes, he said, maybe Stalin ought to be told. Yes, international control, that may have something to go for it. Yes, Churchill's monopolistic outlook is a problem, said FDR, but I'll take care of Churchill. Alas for Bohr and Anderson, it was really, I suspect, Churchill who took care of the president. At any rate, when they next met in September 1944, the president's Hyde Park home, Churchill and Roosevelt initialed an atomic understanding which is best remembered today for affirming their desire for joint Anglo-American atomic cooperation, not just in wartime, but going into the peacetime as well. But that document also contains a repudiation of Niels Bohr and international control. Now, historians debate whether FDR bowed before the Churchillian storm, or whether FDR never really agreed with Bohr's ideas. He just let him think he agreed with them. But Churchill's anti-Bohr prejudice is, I think, unquestionable. The scientist Churchill wrote at the time, and he was wrong on this, Winston, I have to say, was all for giving away to Stalin every last atomic secret. No, he wasn't. But Bohr, in Churchill's mind, was very close to, quote, the edge of mortal crimes. And Churchill wondered whether he ought, perhaps, to be locked up. Anderson was rather shocked by Churchill's attack on an honorable man and did his best to put the PM straight, and succeeded to the extent that Bohr retained his liberty for the rest of the war. And over the last 8 months of the war, Anderson continued to try in subtle various ways to sell international control to Churchill, but he got absolutely nowhere. Indeed, once the Trinity test out in the wilds of New Mexico in July 1945 proved that the atomic bomb was a real weapon, not just a theoretical weapon, Churchill's monopolistic convictions hardened. And at the same time, Churchill began to entertain the idea that the bomb and the Anglo-American monopoly of the bomb might just be used as a diplomatic lever to make Stalin accept a settlement in Europe, particularly over Poland, based on Western democratic precepts. To Anderson, though, such thinking was anathema. It was a guarantee of a murderous and future nuclear arms race, and their relationship became very strained. In the event, Churchill had no real time to factor the A-bomb into his Soviet diplomacy. The 1945 general election saw him lose office soon thereafter. As for Anderson, he was retained by the Labour government as an atomic advisor for 18 months. I think testimony to the respect that all political parties had for a man with a reputation for putting national interest ahead of personal or partisan political interests. Well, in the end, as we all know, international control never materialized. Instead, the Cold War and the nuclear arms race that Anderson bore and a lot of other people had feared came to pass, and it left the world teetering on the brink of calamity. Anderson, tired and disillusioned, stood down as a member of Parliament in 1950. But a year later, when Churchill returned to power, he asked Anderson to join his government. Anderson declined. "He needs you," said Lord Moran, admonishing him, to which Anderson replied that he could not, quote, afford to join the government. What he may have meant was that he was going to find it impossible to provide his wife, the socialite, and some would say social climbing, Ava, known even to her close friends as Becky Sharp personified, with the lifestyle she expected on a ministerial salary. Ava, you might also know, or perhaps you don't, was the widow of Rafe Wigram, the Foreign Office official who in the 1930s supplied Churchill with a lot of vital information on German rearmament before Wigram's untimely death. Anderson did, however, accept a peerage. He became Lord Waverley in 1952 and continued to advise the government informally on atomic matters. He died aged 76 in 1958. So then, shortly before his death, Anderson fell to reminiscing about the war with J. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, the director of the Manhattan Project's Los Alamos bomb lab. Anderson, a really sweet guy, Oppenheimer recalled, had never, and I'm still quoting Oppenheimer, had never been reconciled to the fact that Bohr's counsel had not been followed by Churchill or Roosevelt in 1944, nor, Anderson might have added, his own counsel. Look, I think however one regards the atomic aspect of Sir John Anderson's career, and his outlook does now seem idealistic, unrealistic, naive even, knowing what we do about Stalin's nuclear ambitions, I hope you'll at least agree that Anderson's importance to Churchill and Churchill's dependence on him at times makes Anderson deserving of being remembered for something more, important though it was, but something more than a garden-based bomb shelter. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Good morning. Thank you, Ted, for those initial words. William Lyon Mackenzie King. While the major participants on the Allied side in the Second World War were Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the contribution by what could be called the Second Division was a significant factor in the successful outcome of the war. This sector included the members of the British Empire and Commonwealth. Of the Dominions, the major contributor in the war was Canada. The contribution of that country in the war was opined by the British historian Richard Holmes in his book, In the Footsteps of Churchill. Holmes wrote, in 1940-1941, Britain would not have survived as an independent nation had it not been for the agricultural, industrial, and financial aid received from Canada. Holmes also wrote in that book, the Canadian contribution was remarkable. In terms of manpower, it produced over 1 million volunteers for the Allied armed forces, with 42,000 killed out of a population of 11 million. As usual, only the squeaking wheels get the grease. The quietly competent Canadians and their low-key Prime Minister deserve more credit than they have received or than I can give here. The low-key Prime Minister was William Lyon Mackenzie King. He was born on December the 17th, 1874, just 17 days after the birth of Winston Churchill. They were similar in height, 5'6", and in the color of their eyes, blue. However, that similarity did not extend to their scholarly achievements. Whereas Churchill was an indifferent scholar, King was a brilliant student with degrees from the universities of Toronto, Chicago, and Harvard. Harvard wished him to join its faculty, and it took an intervention by Canada's Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, to insist that King's future was in Canada. Although only 26 years of age, King occupied the senior civil service position of Deputy Minister of Labour when Winston Churchill arrived in Ottawa in December 1900 to speak on his Boer War exploits. The two men met, but it was not a success. King found Churchill drinking champagne at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the rather priggish King was not impressed. By 1908, King had achieved great success in solving contentious labor disputes. And this came to the attention of the President of the United States, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. The President was concerned with the increase in the numbers of Japanese arriving in the United States, and he invited King to meet him. The result of the meeting was a request that King intercede with the British government, which had a friendly relationship with the Japanese government, to put pressure on Japan in that regard. In March 1908, King sailed to England and met with Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Minister. The result was a much reduced flow of immigrants and improvement in American-Japanese relations. On that trip to Britain, King met Churchill again, and his diary showed that his opinion of Churchill had much improved. He wrote, "One cannot talk with him without being impressed with the nimbleness of his mind, his quickness of perception, and his undoubted ability." That same year, 1908, King was elected as a Member of Parliament and was appointed Canada's first Minister of Labour. But just 3 years later, the governing Liberal Party was defeated and King lost his seat. With the coming of war in 1914, the almost 40-year-old King was an unlikely candidate for the military. Another prospect soon presented itself, however. His impressive record in solving labor disputes had come to the attention of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was involved in a serious and bloody dispute in Colorado. And King was invited to join the foundation as Director of Research with a salary of $12,000 a year, a substantial income in those days. King solved the Colorado dispute, and he later worked for other US companies such as Bethlehem Steel, General Electric, Standard Oil, and the Carnegie Corporation. But he returned to Ottawa in 1919 to contest the leadership of the Liberal Party, and he was successful. 2 years later, a general election was held, with the Liberal Party assuming office, and King was now Prime Minister. Just 9 months later, in September 1922, Britain, in the form of the colonial minister, Winston Churchill, requested that Canada pledge troops to a possible military action against the Turkish army. King responded that the request would be considered by Canada's Parliament. However, King had no intention of acceding to the request. Canada had suffered 61,000 fatalities in World War I, with a further 172,000 wounded out of a population of just 8 million, and King knew the people would not stand for the further shedding of blood. That matter blew over, but it emphasized to King that Canada could no longer continue in a subservient position. When Britain had declared war on Germany in 1914, Canada was automatically at war, and King was determined to change the basis of the relationship. At the Imperial Conference of 1923, the autocratic British Foreign Minister Lord Curzon put forward a resolution that when the British Foreign Minister spoke, he spoke not just for Britain, but for the whole of the empire. Countries such as Australia and New Zealand agreed as they looked for Britain's protection, but Canada, in the form of Mackenzie King, disagreed. King won the day, and his further efforts resulted in the Balfour Declaration of 1926, which stated that the United Kingdom and the Dominions are, quote, autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another, in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs. King's Liberal Party lost a general election held in 1930, which was fortuitous as the Conservative government had to deal with the Great Depression. The Liberal Party was re-elected in 1935, and King was again Prime Minister. The following year, he was in London, and he met with Churchill. And he was told Britain was never in greater danger, and that inside of 5 years, it was possible that she would be a vassal state of Germany. King was not supportive of Churchill's efforts to sway the government, and with his background in labor negotiations, he fully supported the appeasement policy of Neville Chamberlain. In May 1937, King was in London for the coronation of King George VI, and he met with the German ambassador to Britain, von Ribbentrop. There was a common link, as Ribbentrop had worked in Ottawa prior to the First World War. Ribbentrop suggested that King should meet with Hitler. That was arranged, and in June 1937, King presented himself at the Hindenburg Palace. King recorded the conversation in his diary, and he makes astonishing reading as Hitler went to great lengths to portray himself as a man of peace. Quoting from King's diary, Hitler went on to say, as far as war is concerned, you need have no fear of war at the instance of Germany. We have no desire for war, and we don't want war. Remember that I myself have been through a war, and not one of us wants to see another war. King was obviously impressed and relieved by Hitler's statement, but to his credit, he did state that if Britain was attacked, Canada would come to Britain's aid. Whether that made any impression on Hitler is not evident, but it certainly made no impact on his future decisions. On September 3rd, 1939, with Britain declaring war on Germany, King broadcast to the people of Canada. This included, "The forces of evil have been loosed in the world. I appeal to my fellow Canadians to unite in a national effort to save from destruction all that makes life worth living, and to preserve for future generations those liberties and institutions which others have bequeathed to us. On September the 9th, Canada's Parliament passed legislation declaring war on Germany. It is one thing to be at war and another to be able to wage war. Canada in 1939 was totally unprepared. However, deficiencies were quickly remedied. On September the 26th, Canada agreed to be a training ground for airmen from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. This achieved spectacular results, with 130,000 pilots and aircrew trained, and with Canada assuming 3/4 of the cost of $1.6 billion. President Franklin Roosevelt later declared that Canada was the aerodrome of democracy. In March 1940, a general election was held in Canada, with King's Liberal Party winning in a landslide. Churchill cabled King the next day, "Sincere personal congratulations on your victory. I am very glad we shall continue our work for the common cause." When Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, King sent him a telegram assuring him of the wholehearted support and cooperation of Canada and his government colleagues and himself, and wishing him, quote, "vision and endurance in guiding public affairs at this most critical of hours." Both Churchill and King knew that to win the war, the United States had to join the Allies. But in the spring of 1940, President Roosevelt was far from convinced that Britain would survive. This was illustrated by Secretary of State Cordell Hull requesting that King line up the Dominions to bring pressure on Britain, not to make a soft peace with Hitler. And if Britain was to be defeated, then prior to this happening, the British fleet should be sailed to ports in the North American hemisphere. King wrote to Churchill explaining the United States' concerns. The following day, Churchill responded, pointing out that if the United States was in the war and Britain was conquered, then the fleet would be transferred from the clutches of Germany. But if the United States continued to be neutral and Britain was overpowered, then he couldn't tell what policy would be adopted by a pro-German administration. King forwarded Churchill's response to Washington. Needless to say, Roosevelt and Hull were most concerned with Churchill's attitude, which they considered was, quote, alarming and distressing. And they asked King to continue to dialogue with Churchill, giving the dubious reason, not on the basis of an American plan, but primarily to save the British Empire. King was uncomfortable at being the linchpin in the correspondence, and he assured Churchill of Canada's continued support, which he illustrated in a radio broadcast on June the 7th, 1940. I speak the heart and mind of our country when I say that every fort in Canada will be another Calais, and every harbor will be another Dunkirk, before the men and women of our land allow the light and life of their Christian faith to be extinguished by the powers of evil or yield their liberties to the tyranny of Nazi brutality. The following month, the attitude of Roosevelt had changed after Churchill's action in attacking the French fleet to keep it out of Hitler's control. The president was now determined to provide support, which initially came in an innovative plan to provide Britain with 40 destroyers. This action was welcomed by King, as was Roosevelt's proposal of the establishment of a joint board comprised of an equal number of representatives from the United States and Canada to devise strategies for ensuring protection of the northern half of the Western Hemisphere. What became known as the Ogdensburg Agreement basically agreed that the United States would help protect Canada's territory. King and Roosevelt kept in regular communications, and at the request of King, they met in April 1941 at the president's home, Hyde Park, New York. King pointed out that Britain was basically bankrupt, and Canada had a serious shortage of US dollars. King suggested a form of barter. Canada would manufacture munitions for the US in exchange for the purchase of American war material. While Roosevelt was initially against the agreement as it might be going too far, for something manufactured in Canada for the United States to lend lease to Britain. However, the concerns were overcome, and the Hyde Park Declaration was a significant achievement and ended Canada's financial difficulties for the remainder of the war. On June the 1st, 1941, King broadcast to the people of Britain, and this included, "We have been inspired by your bravery, your undaunted courage, and your determination to fight to the end. May I send to you, Mr. Churchill, warmest greetings and remembrances of what to me has been a valued friendship of many years. To us, you are the personification of Britain in this, her greatest hour." Churchill responded the next day to the people of Canada, and this included, "Your comradeship in this mortal struggle. Cheers and 45s of the people of these islands. It must seem strange that Canada, free from all compulsion or pressure, so many thousands of miles away, should hasten forward into the van of the battle against the evil forces of the world. The people of Great Britain are proud of the fact that the liberty of thought and action they have won through their long romantic history should have taken root throughout the length and breadth of a continent from Halifax to Victoria." In August 1941, King flew to Britain and spoke in a dinner in the Mansion House. He started by speaking of the courage and commitment of the British people, and especially of the Londoners. He then addressed Churchill. "By the power of your eloquence, by the energy of your conduct, and by the genius of your leadership, you have galvanized a great people into heroic action, rarely equaled and never excelled in the history of warfare." King concluded with a familiar theme, that to win the war, it was necessary for the United States to be a full participant. The United States did enter the war in December 1941, and Churchill arrived to discuss strategy and speak to Congress. He then traveled to Ottawa to address the Canadian Parliament. The Toronto Globe and Mail reported, "Puffing a big cigar and smiling broadly, Winston Churchill, the Empire's great war leader, arrived today in the senior Dominion to receive a welcome which he will remember to his dying day." His speech to the Canadian Parliament included his "some chicken, some neck" reference. Afterwards, he was photographed by Koch and the roaring lion portrait resulted one of the most famous photos in the annals of that medium. Interestingly, Clementine Churchill later told King that she did not like the Karsh picture, and neither did Winston. While King kept a low profile, in December 1942, he addressed the Pilgrims of New York. And he took the opportunity of pointing out the contribution that Canada was making in the war. He gave many statistics on the Canadian war production. And while many facts were difficult to assimilate, one statistic was easily understood. We are supplying 200 pounds of food per annum for every man, woman, and child in the United Kingdom. King was content to let Churchill and Roosevelt make the major war decisions, with Canada accepting whatever it was allotted. However, when Canada was not accorded recognition in communiques on its part in both the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and northern France in June 1944, he reacted with fury and corrections were made. With the end of the war, a general election was held in Canada. The Conservative opposition built its campaign on its criticism of the Liberals' government's handling of the war effort, whereas King adopted a positive program of future prosperity, and they won a clear victory. In November 1947, King was in London for the marriage of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. He dined with Churchill, and by this time, his opinion had changed. He wrote in his diary, "I confess that as I looked at him across the table, I felt that perhaps, in more respects than one, he was the greatest man of our times." King, his health deteriorating, retired in the summer of 1948 after 21 years as Prime Minister. This was and still is a record for longevity of a Prime Minister in all of British and Commonwealth history. King died in 1950. On January the 14th, 1952, Winston Churchill spoke at a dinner in Ottawa on King. "I made a lifelong friendship with him, and I shared my grief with all Canada and indeed the free world at his death after so many years of faithful and skillful service to the great causes which we uphold today." Thank you.
Ted, thank you for your kind introduction. I think my mother would have been delighted, but on the other hand, my father would have been amazed. As you might imagine, there's a lot of ground to be covered here, and you'll find that I will not always read the text on the slides, so I ask you to read them as you listen to my additional comments with your active listening antenna. We got the slides up? We going or not?
No, you need to find your slides.
Go ahead for me, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
This one, which one?
Go, that's me.
This
Go
one?
ahead. Shoot. That's it, that's it.
Yeah,
You got it?
Just put it up here for you.
Thank you.
There you go. And then you've got the clicker.
Good. Thank you, John. It's some 50 years this year since Moran published his diary and created an uproar. Yet his son, Lord John Moran, tried to do something about it, although he died a couple of years ago, published his father's book in 2 volumes. In 2003, his volumes, 1940, years 1940-1945, and then in 2006, covering the years 1945 to 1920, with several additions and a rewriting of the last 5 chapters of the book, where the essay was one of a few pages, and he omitted the word decrepit, which had upset the family quite a lot. John Moran, his son's comment was that his father's diary, he wanted it to be regarded as an invaluable source for anyone interested in understanding the doctor as well as his patient, and that, quote, the controversy be put to rest. The controversy played out in the Times in many different ways, and the correspondence sort of concludes with Moran trying to defend himself in this way, saying very simply, you know, if you don't understand Churchill's health issues, you don't understand Churchill in the last 25 years of his life. This portrait of Moran was completed in June 1951 by Pietro Annigoni and hangs in the Royal College of Physicians, of which he was the president from 1941 to 1950, and succeeded by his friend, Lord Brain. Some of his friends and detractors have commented that this portrait reveals much about his character and personality, thought to be somewhat cunning. And yes, it's some 75 years since Churchill met Moran, or Moran met Churchill, as he would put it. He made his way to Admiralty House, wondering how he would actually take care of him and actually discuss things with him. He stood there for some time waiting for a response, and eventually Churchill makes the comment, "I don't know why anybody is going to bother to see me. This is right ridiculous. In fact, all I have is dyspepsia." Well, that's not entirely true, of course. On the other hand, an orthopedic surgeon published in 2013 a book about Churchill's medical issues. He had several harsh words to say about Moran and was highly critical of Moran not conducting a physical examination at this first visit. Later, he goes on to say that Moran was a self-promoter and a master of the spin, citing Jock Colville's comment that Moran was rarely at the center of events, but would be invited to lunch the next day and told what happened. So who pushed Moran onto Churchill? Well, it's really his 2 friends, Beaverbrook and Bracken. They were both patients of Moran in his Harley Street private practice. Each of them had pulmonary and chest problems. Both were likely familiar with the general notion that Churchill had a, quote, weak chest. We know also, of course, that Clemmy didn't like either of these gentlemen, which I suspect was somewhat significant as well. Churchill had a lot of things besides dyspepsia in his past history, and of course we don't know whether Moran actually got a full accounting of all of these issues. So what was this weak chest? He nearly died of pneumonia. It affected both lungs while he was at the school in Brighton in 1896. Hence, he went to Harrow School and not to Eton, which is where his father went. The sense was, why? Because Harrow School was on a hill where the air would be less putrid. You can read this as I go along with a few comments. Moran actually was interested in becoming a writer before his father, a general practitioner, insisted that he had to go to medical school. He did go to medical school there at St. Mary's. I think the most interesting correlation here is the remark that Moran makes about himself here, because Churchill wrote also in the biography of Marlborough about childhood. He says, this is Churchill, "Famous men are usually the product of an unhappy childhood. The stern compression of circumstances, the twinges of adversity, the spur of slights and taunts," I'm sorry, am I flicking on? "In early years are needed to evoke that ruthless ferocity of purpose and tenacious mother wit without which great actions are seldom accomplished." A hint here that both of them had some sense about their own childhood. So what of his personality and his character? Maybe some early insight for him. He served in the First World War in the trenches. Initially, he was not particularly interested in these people coming from the front to be examined, and was thought that they were scrimshankers and they ought to have been sent right back to the front. Well, later on, he catches on maybe that there's something, sorry, I beg your pardon. Later on, he catches on that something else is really going on here, and when he's researching their poisoning with mustard gas and bringing along a number of these young people, he gets to the sense that maybe something a little different is going on. And so, coming to the end of things with the ravages of war, he really has a serious effect on a soldier, in the sense that this has a serious effect on a soldier's innate ability to soldier on. And it's the first time we really get the sense of this comment of battle fatigue, then shell shock, and now what we understand to be PTSD. He wanted to get Churchill's blessing on his book. He thought this would be something that would be very useful in getting it published. Churchill had once volunteered to invite a preface to the book. Unfortunately, Moran was mistaken, and Churchill declined after he dipped into the text, saying they might injure recruiting, and besides, he had no patience with all of the damned psychological nonsense. Maybe this was a shadow of his black dog. Oh, his black dog? Oh, my goodness. One of the things that upset people most, I think, in the family was for the first time, or they thought it was the first time, this black dog was surfacing and had some sense of a stigma that was attached to that. Maybe some remembered Churchill's observations of psychiatrists. I'm sure it'd be sensible to restrict as much as possible the work of these gentlemen who are capable of doing an immense amount of harm with what may be very easily degenerate into charity. The tightest hand should be kept over them. So what really did Moran believe about this business of his black dog? Is this more than just, in fact, a reaction to circumstances and a thwarted ambition, or was there a trait going back as far as the first Duke of Marlborough? Suffice it to say that Churchill was a moody man that even Clemmy had to upbraid for belligerent streak. And his son Randolph was eloquent in his interview with Dr. Feeve, a psychiatrist, about his father's mood swings. Well, was Moran any good as a primary care physician in selecting good doctors? Probably for the most part he did, and was pretty discerning. Just a couple of comments on the surgeon and the medical pharmacologist highlighted in red here. Sir Thomas Dunhill was 71 years old when he operated on Churchill in 1947. He'd been a pioneer in thyroid surgery. He was doing a hernia, so he practiced on several National Health Service patients before he cut on Churchill in 1947. Dr. Bottle was an expert in the use of medication of M&B and was flown in from Italy to consult on this drug for Churchill's pneumonia in 1943. Moran does not mention Dr. Bottle or his vital role in his diary. What did he think of those he chose? Well, in his diary, he wasn't exactly the nicest about his two colleagues. Jock Colvin, in his diary, The Fringes of Power, Downing Street Diary, published in 1985, comments on Moran. Though Moran is vain, egotistical, and exceedingly indiscreet, his judgment of people is often shrewd, though by no means always right. But he did have some good friends, and Lord Richardson was the second cardiologist for Churchill, and here he is with his wife, Moran with his wife Dorothy, who had become a great friend of Lord Richardson's wife Sybil, a portrait artist. Lord Richardson's daughters, Anne and Claire, to his right, are both still alive. All right, was he any good as a doctor? Well, this is a particularly interesting incident that people keep saying, well, you know, Churchill had a heart attack. Moran is on his own. He's in Washington and the White House in December 1941. Churchill calls the next morning and says, you know, I was trying to lift a window and I got this sort of pain in the right side of my chest and up my right arm. Well, Moran jumped on it and said, okay, I'll take his blood pressure and his pulse. He couldn't get access to an EKG machine, but concluded by the description that Churchill had indeed had a heart attack, meaning a myocardial infarction, and said, you got to rest. Well, the next day, of course, he's before Congress giving a talk, and he's up in Ottawa very quickly after that giving another talk. So Churchill hardly rested, which made me wonder when I started doing my research, well, possibly he did not have a heart attack. Well, in Sir John Parkinson's notes, which do not appear in Lord Moran's diary, he makes the point to Churchill, you think you had a coronary thrombosis? Sir, you didn't. Your EKG shows you have no damage to your heart. The best I can imagine is you had a slight embarrassment to your heart circulation, maybe angina. So this led out to the idea I think that a lot of people have had. I didn't advance, did I? I beg your pardon. John, we're stuck. Sorry, I should have shown that slide. Just watch your hand here. Is that what it is? Now it should work. Shoot. There you go. And of course, it's led to the myth that really Churchill had a dicky heart. What I mean by that, it meant that he had to have medications for his heart very soon after that. The only time we know he really had to have digitalis was actually was in Carthage when he had double pneumonia. Both lungs were affected, and his heart, in fact, was failing. So what about the last 25 years of Churchill's medical issues? These are pretty straightforward, and the family had this comment all along, and that was when they felt that Churchill had something wrong with him, you first call Lord Moran, who then call for the real doctor. He had a lot of other things that Lord Moran didn't mention in his book at all. He gives a little copy to these other things. There actually is very little in the diary of specific medical issues, such as the blood pressures, heart rates, or temperatures. There's one exception in January 1947 where he says, when I examined Winston's retinal arteries with my ophthalmoscope, I found definite hardening of the arteries, but not more than one would expect after the stress of the war. Heard a lot, I imagine, about the various medications that Churchill was given by Lord Moran. As Churchill commented on, he was a vendor of nostrums. I don't think Moran was a vendor of nostrums. He gave Churchill his pills, whom he put in his own pill box and took when he felt like he needed them. And of course, fortunately, they had different colors, so when it was a red, he was able to find the red. And when it was a green, he was able to find the green, all mixed into his pill box. The actual pill box still exists. It's in a collection at the University of Charleston in South Carolina. John, I just messed up again. I'm sorry. Just hit that. I got it. Sorry. The one interesting thing that Moran gave to Moran was amphetamines. Remember, he had his stroke in June of 1953, and the question was, with his muzzy brain, would he be able to pull it off there at the Margate conference and do a spectacular performance? Well, just before, 2 days before, he gave him some amphetamines, and Churchill said, oh my, it's cleared my head completely. So when he did actually come to give the presentation at the conference, he gave a spectacular performance. Here you see Eden smiling and laughing, and Clemmy was smiling and laughing. In fact, his son-in-law, Nicholas Soames, was very concerned. I'm not sure if you can see him in the back there with a sort of a grim face, but he was very, very anxious that his father-in-law was going to be able to pull it off. So what might this tell us of Moran's character? There's one incident where he was trying to get things organized with the National Health Service coming on board so that the hospital-based consultants would in fact make sure they get more money than the general practitioners. The British Medical Association had a different view and were very angry when he was able to succeed in that. So his admirers thought, though, that he demonstrated outstanding political skills, his opponents showed that his deviousness and his untrustworthiness, hence he got the nickname of Corkscrew Charlie. And did this dog him for the rest of his life? This is a portrait by Lady Sybil Richardson. And he said, when I put down my pen, I wished to be sure that I had reported faithfully those who have talked to me about Winston Churchill. I trusted in checking these conversations. I forgot no one. This is in his preface to the diary. Unfortunately, the diary is not a diary. Consider omission of certain critical medical events. For instance, the hip repair in 1962 does not appear in the diary. Certain events are completely inaccurate. Some dates are not in the source notes, and some physicians are written out, just as I mentioned, Dr. Bottle. But were there reasons for many to be upset with the publishing of another book? Lord Allenbrook had published a diary in 1957, which in fact surprised Churchill. In that were some comments by Lord Allenbrook, which I don't think Churchill would have appreciated. He says, Churchill was quite the most difficult man to work with whom I have ever struck, but I would not have missed the chance of working with him for anything on earth. Very quickly after Churchill's death, Lady Violet Bonham Carter in August of 1945 publishes her book. And maybe she was absolved, as she was known to have been a close friend of Winston, likely agreeing from the tone of her book with Churchill's statement, "We are all worms, but I believe I am a glowworm." So what might be said in some degree of commentary from others about this furor? I think to get some insight into Clemmy, who is mad as all get out about the book being published, although Moran said that he told her, and in fact there's no evidence he in fact did tell her. I think if you read Sonia Purnell's book on Clemmy, you'll get some sense that, you know, Clemmy really was a supporter in no uncertain terms of Winston, and so she would just in general be upset with the book being published. Randolph was mad, as he was the official biographer, and felt that Moran had compromised the publishing of his first volume. The rest of the family, the words that appear are, they felt besmirched and stigmatized. His political colleagues eventually published a book in 1968 entitled Action This Day, Working with Churchill, to correct Moran's errors of perception and historic inaccuracies. What about the British Medical Association? Well, there's a resolution of censure, which he just brushed off. That's the BMA. But today, still the release of confidential medical information on public figures is controversial. There was an article just recently in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, which was tracing out FDR's medical matters which have been recently released or added to, and again criticized the notion of people revealing things in a confidential manner about their patients. Okay, so what did others really finally conclude? Others have also identified Moran's correctness in publishing his diary, with one professor of political science commenting, besides Trevelyan, the doyen historians, the topical question of whether a patient's confidence has been outraged by a physician's account of him both in his strength and in his weakness will no longer agitate the reader. This is an article of about a year ago when this historian had really looked at the issue of confidentiality and said probably when all's said and done, Moran publishing his diary was the first one that broke the code on this issue of confidentiality with notable people. Is that the last word? Well, I don't think so. Lady Solmes herself should probably have the last word. She commented always the gracious lady, even maybe with some misgivings. Lord Moran understood Winston thoroughly, and he was indeed fortunate to have a doctor, a man who understood not only the medical considerations and risks to his patient, but who was also fully aware of the implications with regard to the office he held and his condition at any time. I think Churchill should have the last word. He relied heavily on Lord Moran and really had a great affection for him, saying, "It's wonderful that you've kept me going for so long." And he was actually 85 when he said this, and you know he lived another 5 years. I think Moran did become very close to Churchill, as Moran himself claims did help Churchill, quote, open his heart and feel better for his candor. This disclosing of such an intimacy by Moran may have especially disturbed his family and medical colleagues. Moran's revelations opened up the possibility that Churchill was human after all, and hence not worthy of our admiration and honor. Both men's lives will be admired for generations to come. Yes, admired. Notwithstanding the clay feet of Churchill, his reputation really remains undiminished. So thank you for your attention, and it's question time.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of the presenters for staying so closely to time. That gives us about 15 minutes or so for questions and, of course, answers. So if you can raise your hand, I'll identify you. And if you have a question for everyone, that's excellent. If you'd like to direct it to a particular speaker, please say so. Let's, the gentleman right at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask a question about the atomic bomb diplomacy. You mentioned the breakdown in the Bohr's relationship with, or his proposal, but you didn't have a chance, I guess, to continue what happened with the U.S.-British relationship after the war. You mentioned the joint agreement that was signed, but in the same way that perhaps Bohr was too idealistic or Anderson was too idealistic, was Churchill too idealistic in terms of expecting the United States to actually continue sharing the atomic diplomacy? And was he bitter when it broke down? Thank you.
It's a good question. Is this on? Can you hear me? Is this working? Can you hear me now? No? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Right. Full stop. Yeah. It's a good question. I'd reached the conclusion that for somebody who loved America so well, that sometimes I felt that Churchill didn't always understand the American rules of governance and constitutional niceties. And there are two critical agreements that he reaches with Roosevelt during the war. One is August 1943 at Quebec, and that's a very important one because that's the mutual consent agreement. So in other words, the bomb will not be used against a third party unless both America and the UK agree. So that's one. The other one was in September 1944. That's the one I showed on the slide. And what that refers to is the desire of both FDR and Churchill to continue atomic collaboration going into the peacetime. So it wasn't just a wartime expedient. Now, what happens after 1945, of course, is that A, FDR is dead, B, Churchill is kicked out of office, and C, in 1946, the US Congress, in what you could call a sort of nationalist spasm, decides that the bomb and whatever wartime agreements existed were immaterial. I think probably constitutionally it was absolutely right that the executive agreements hammered out in wartime did not have standing in the peacetime. Now, Churchill is bereft. He is aghast by the McMahon Act. And when he comes back in 1951, it is his firm desire. He really felt that those two FDR agreements were the bedrock of future Anglo-American relations. He suspects that the McMahon Act would not have been passed had he been in power, and it was some kind of American attempt to protect themselves against a socialistic government in the UK. And he bends might and main after 1951, especially when Eisenhower comes in, to try and get back to those kind of things. Was he idealistic? I think the idealism comes towards the very end of his life, where if you're aware of his very brilliant March 1955 H-bomb speech. It's his last great speech in the House of Commons, where he's virtually coming up with mutually assured destruction. He's a nuclear visionary himself. He's coming very close to embracing, towards the end of his political career, the kind of things that I think Bohr and Anderson would have liked him to embrace earlier on. So I hope that answers in some way your question. It was a great question.
Let's go to the gentleman closer to the front on this side of the room.
Good morning. This question is directed to John. Often you hear from non-Churchillians, of course I've never heard this from a Churchillian, that Winston Churchill was an alcoholic and he was a drunk. And of course we all know the famous quote that Churchill said that he said something to the effect that he gets more out of alcohol than alcohol out of him. John, being a physician and reviewing a lot of the medical information regarding Winston Churchill. Was there any indication that he had any of the medical problems related to alcohol consumption?
I try to leave that out. It's a very interesting question, actually, because he clearly imbibed a lot of alcoholic beverage and clearly was able to handle it very well. And we do know of a situation where if you steadily imbibe alcohol, at least as a man, your alcohol dehydrogenase in your liver increases, hence you're able to sort of do more to process the alcohol as you imbibe more and more. Remember, he rarely drank, quote, alcoholic beverage outside of meals. And when he did, he had this sort of little whiskey snifter that Lady Mary Soames kindly showed me one day, taking a large glass and filling it up with ice and putting, I think, maybe more than a thimbleful of scotch in it, and then filling it up with soda. And he used to sort of sip on that all day. When you think about it, that's probably keeping his coronaries open all day anyway. Further than that, the usual question is, well, was he really a classic alcoholic? The answer is we only know of one time when he was completely, as they say, S-canned. That was when he was actually in Moscow with Eden and was meeting with Stalin, and they were plying them with alcohol, and Eden and Churchill were licking back the vodka. Unfortunately, Stalin was licking back the water that was in his glass. And at the end, they walk out, and his Sergeant Manners, who's still, I believe, living in California, and had the role of being his security advisor, watched them, he says, wobble down the street to their hotel and refuse to get into their taxi. So that's the only time I know of for sure there's an eyewitness to the fact that he was an alcoholic. There's one other time alluded to, Lord Allenbrook thought that he'd caught him actually drunk when he was in the war rooms. Unfortunately, he caught him 30 minutes after he'd had his second on. So here was the barbitol on board still, and he, yes, indeed, probably wobbled out from his bed there, taking his afternoon nap. But Allenbrook thought he was drunk. I don't think he was drunk.
I have to say that that advice on alcohol consumption may be the most encouraging thing I've heard for a very long time. Let's go to the gentleman at the back of the room there.
I would like just to start by saying how much I have personally appreciated the Canadians' arrival in England in 1940. The 1st Canadian Division arrived, and they were virtually the only a group of troops that we had to protect us. I also appreciated them because I can remember them with their feet up on our fender in our kitchen, billeted on us, giving me lollipops and American comics, including Little Orphan Annie. The question I would like to ask is, at the end of the war, I believe the Canadians forgave Britain her debts. And I would like to ask, if you know, how much that forgiveness was in financial terms.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. Am I on here?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure exactly how much they gave. The total amount that Canada gave to Britain and lent to Britain during the war was $3.2 billion, $3.2 billion, and that was used for manufactures of foodstuffs and machinery and military equipment. But after the war, as you probably know, the United States and Canada gave $5 billion. They gave a loan at 2% interest of $5 billion. And this was just paid. It came into prominence just maybe 7 or 8 years ago when the loan was paid off. And all I remember about that time was that the United States' $3.8 billion loan was paid off. I didn't see anything about the $1.2 billion loan at the same time, which was paid off to Canada. And when, as you know, not throwing the flag around too much here, but as you know, with the United States having 10 times the population of Canada, mathematically, Canada gave over 3 times as much in that loan, the low interest.
I think we have time for one more question, if the question and the answer are both sufficiently brief. I saw the gentleman in the very back there first, so I'll turn to him.
I'd direct this to the gentleman about Churchill and the bomb. And I'd like to make a couple of comments on how the Soviet Union viewed this process during that time. The simple fact of the matter is that during the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, there were many conferences, some of which were sponsored by Niels Bohr, where both Soviet scientists and Western scientists interacted. And there was a considerable cross-fertilization of ideas. And that the fact that the West took the assumption the Soviets knew nothing about these matters is really, in retrospect, totally incorrect. And the Soviets were very sophisticated. They were behind in the engineering of how to construct a bomb, but the theoretical aspects of it, they had mastered. And as we go forward and jump forward from mutual assured destruction, the fact is that in peacetime alone, there have been 1,000 nuclear detonations by testing and by war in the last 4 or 5 decades. And both the Soviets and our scientists came to be very concerned about not just mutual assured destruction, but extermination of life on this planet if a large number were brought to the surface of our devices and detonated at the same time. And as it turned out, it was the Green Party of the Russian Orthodox Church that convinced the committees considering Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative to go ahead, ignore the SDI, and proceed and accept the SALT treaties. And this is a fact not commonly known, that the Russian Orthodox Church played a role in that.
Okay, very briefly, both those points were actually very well made and very interesting. I'll just comment in return on the first point. I think it's just one of the, you could say, almost tragic coincidences of 20th century history that the discovery of nuclear fission, of nuclear chain reactions, really occurs as a certain year called 1939 is born, and so there's a world war looming at the end of that year. And of course, that is what propels things forward thereafter. But you're absolutely right. In the so-called International Republic of Science, the ideas about nuclear fission throughout the first 9 months, up to September 1939, there were, Martin Sherwin has estimated, something like 90 serious papers published in country after country around the world, the Soviet Union, Italy, the UK, the USA, you name it. So when all that internationalization of knowledge kind of grinds to a halt when the war starts, the fact is the genie's out of the bottle. And I think people like Bohr and people like Anderson, and I do think his scientific background is important here, they knew that this thing, if it worked, was not just going to be a greater aggregation of TNT and so on and so forth. They knew that this was a potentially apocalyptic development and that it would be very naive and presumptuous to assume that the Soviet Union, or anybody else for that matter, if they had access to resources, could not at some point in the future get this thing. And so I think, yes, wartime use, Bohr was in favor of wartime use, Anderson was as well, but it's what you do afterwards. But that was a step that Churchill, rightly or wrongly, and I think contextually we can understand exactly why he did what he did, refused to take. But your points were very well made. I appreciate them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we all know what we have to do after this panel, which is to step outside for just a few minutes for a cup of coffee, and then return to hear Andrew Roberts in just a very few minutes. So let me close with a thanks to all 3 of the panelists, and turn it over to David.
I just want to thank all the panelists for reaffirming the indisputable brilliance of the program chairman of this conference. With that, we will take our first break of the morning. We will resume promptly at 10:45. Thank you.
Good save there.